We're ready to sew a fold guide on the lower portion of our long sleeve. So you're looking for the short ends, and stitching a fold guide isn't necessary if you prefer just to fold up or fold in, I suppose, these short seams 1/4 of an inch and press those in. That works too. You're going to do it to both sides. I'll come back after I'm done pressing these. So after we've pressed the short edges, we've come back and right sides together, pinned starting at the top, that would be the edge with the notch at the top, down to the center notch. This is going to be the end of the slip placket. So we'll stitch up 5/8 of an inch starting at the top down to this notch, and then back stitch a couple times to kind of protect and secure the seam, since there'll be a little bit of tension from the slip placket. I back stitched a couple times at the end. So after this, you'll want to go over to your ironing board and press open this seam, and then you can see the pre-pressed edge will just be available to easily turn under, and we'll be top stitching to have a nice clean finished seam for the placket. You can see here that I have pressed the seam open and then tucked under the edge where we pre-sewed like fold guides. So I'm just going to go over and do a little top stitch on the edge to clean finish this placket. There you have it. You'll want to do one more press, but the lower sleeve slit placket is all complete. We are ready to attach the lower section to the upper section of the Wren sleeve. I've gone ahead and turned the sleeve wrong side out. And what we're looking for is the notch that is in the sleeve. It's like near the hem towards the back. And we're going to, because we're sewing the seam as a French seam, we're going to start with the wrong sides together. So I'm going to place this sort of inside the lower section. And again, we're looking for that notch. And wrong sides together, we're going to pin where the seam of the placket is, slip placket, and that notch. So the lower section of the sleeve is symmetrical. It doesn't really matter which one you are using to sew to each sleeve. There is a notch to help just kind of pin that matches the underseam. That can be helpful, but it's not necessary when attaching these sleeves. The main thing is to make sure this seam of the sleeve slip placket matches up with the notch of the upper sleeve. So you'll just go ahead and pin all the way around in a circle, and then because this is a French seam, we're going to sew it at 1/4 of an inch first. Trim that seam allowance by half. Press it. I say press up, but it really doesn't matter which direction. Just press that seam, and then we'll flip it and sew right sides together next to enclose the seam. Enclosing this seam as a French seam gives the shape of the sleeve a little bit more structure, and it's just like a nice clean finish on the inside. Of course, if you prefer to sew it with a regular seam and finish it with, say, like an overlock, you can sew it at 1/2 of an inch and then trim your seam allowance with your finishing method of serge or zigzag, whatever. So after we're done pinning, I'm going to sew again at 1/4 of an inch. So to finish the French seam, we're just going to sew right sides together now. So you can see I've trimmed the seam to half. We're just going to flip it right sides touching, come over to where the seam is. I use my fingers to kind of make sure that that seam is right in the middle, and then I pin all the way around. And then this seam will be sewn at 1/4 of an inch as well to fully enclose the seam and have a really nice finish on the inside. So I'm gonna take a second and just pin all the way around. Now that I've pinned the lower sleeve to the upper sleeve right sides together, I'm gonna sew the seam at 1/4 of an inch and fully enclose the French seam. After I'm done there, I'm going to take it over to the ironing board and press. I usually press the seam up. Again, it doesn't really matter. And you will have a nice finished French seam at the bottom of your sleeve. So we are ready after this step to go prep our cuffs, and after we are done sewing the cuffs, we'll be attaching them to the bottom of the sleeve. I've stitched a fold guide on one long side of the cuff at 3/8 of an inch and then pressed it wrong sides touching. So then you're going to want to fold the cuff right sides together, making sure there's 3/8 of an inch still showing on the right side. And then we will sew the short ends of the cuffs at 3/8 of an inch. Go ahead and turn the corners. I like to put my finger in, hold down the seam allowance, and then you can use a point turner to get those nice and square. So after you make your corners nice and square, you can give your cuff a press. We are ready to sew the cuff to the sleeve hem. So right sides together, you're going to first find the sleeve where the slit placket is, and then your cuff where the unfolded edge is, right there. You're just going to want to make sure this little corner is nice and exactly the same, and pin all the way around. So you'll be attaching at 3/8 of an inch, and you'll just want to make sure you're not catching the top folded part of the cuff. There you go. I'm going to go sew at 3/8 of an inch. So now you'll want to go over to your iron and press your seams inside towards the cuff, and we'll be pinning the cuff folded edge to cover that seam. Here, I'll add a pin. Like that after we're done pressing, and we'll come back and do a final edge stitch. We are ready to edge stitch the cuff. The seam allowance has been pressed into the cuff and covered by the inside of the cuff that was already folded. I pinned from the right side. I just made sure that this seam was, or the folded edge was covering the seam, and then I came back and pinned the cuff, and I'm going to sew from the right side. I'm going to sew a line just to the right of the seam here, catching the seam, the cuff below. There you have it. An edge stitch on the cuff that catches the back and clean finishes and hides all your seams.